I've got a confession to make. Horror movies that try too hard to scare me rarely work. The jump scares, the loud stings, the thing suddenly rushing the camera. After a while, it all starts to feel predictable. What stays with me is a different kind of horror. The kind that slips into your head quietly and refuses to leave long after the movie is over. The 8 films on this list did exactly that. Most of them flew under the radar, and a few I discovered completely by accident. But every one of them left me with an image, an idea, or a feeling that I couldn't shake. If you're looking for horror that lingers instead of just making you jump, let's get into it. Possessor, 2020. Brandon Cronenberg's Possessor is the film I show people when they tell me body horror is just shock value. Tasia Voss is an assassin who works for a secret organization capable of taking control of other people's bodies through advanced neural interface technology. Using these hosts, she carries out assassinations while inhabiting someone else's life, only to find it increasingly difficult to separate her own identity from the minds she inhabits. That premise alone is unsettling, but what wrecked me wasn't the violence, and there is a lot of it. It was the moment Voss starts losing track of which thoughts are hers. There's a scene where she's rehearsing a mundane domestic line. "I love you. I love this family." And her face just breaks apart trying to perform a feeling she can't locate anymore. I've never hijacked anyone's body, obviously, but I know what it's like to say something on autopilot and suddenly not recognize my own voice saying it. That's the horror Cronenberg is actually selling. Not the invasion of another person, but the slow realization that your own interior life might already be a performance you've stopped noticing. Resurrection 2022. I went into Resurrection expecting a tense psychological drama and left genuinely rattled in a way I wasn't prepared to explain to my friends afterward. Rebecca Hall plays Margaret, a woman whose abusive former partner suddenly reappears in her city decades later. For much of the film, the tension comes from psychological dread and the feeling that the past can return at any moment. There's a long monologue in which Margaret recounts what happened to her years ago, including a detail so disturbing that it's best left unspoiled. Hall carries the scene almost entirely on her own, turning it into one of the most unforgettable moments in the film. What stayed with me was the way Resurrection treats trauma, not as a distant memory, but as a recurring haunting, something that can quietly walk back into your life. What struck me is how the film captures a particular fear. Not necessarily that someone will hurt you again, but the realization that they still have access to a part of you that should have been locked away long ago. Resurrection turns that feeling into horror. It's a film about how some wounds never fully disappear. They simply wait for the right moment to open again. Marrowbone, 2017. This one barely gets mentioned in horror conversations, which baffles me, because Sergio G. Sanchez built something genuinely gothic and aching with Marrowbone. 4 siblings move into a remote house after fleeing their past, and the eldest brother, Jack, makes a promise to protect his family from a presence that may or may not be in the attic. I'm being deliberately vague because the twist genuinely earns its silence, but I'll say this. The film operates on a kind of emotional logic, where grief literally reshapes the architecture of memory. The house itself becomes a reflection of the family's fears, secrets, and unresolved grief. There's a sequence near the end where everything you thought you understood about the siblings' dynamic recontextualizes itself, and I had to pause the film and just sit there. Not because I was scared, because I felt caught. Like the movie had quietly diagnosed something about how grief makes us protect each other through lies that eventually calcify into their own kind of haunting. The Devil's Candy, 2015. Sean Byrne's The Devil's Candy shouldn't work as well as it does. A struggling metalhead painter moves his family into a house with a dark history, and a disturbed drifter who once lived there keeps circling back, hearing voices that command him to harm children. On paper, it sounds like standard possession house fare. In execution, it's one of the most sonically aggressive horror films I've ever sat through, and that's the point. Byrne uses distorted guitar and pure volume as a vehicle for demonic compulsion, like the devil's voice is just feedback nobody can fully tune out. Pruitt Taylor Vince plays the drifter with this devastating, almost childlike confusion about his own violent impulses. And it made me think about how rarely horror lets its monsters be pitiable without excusing them. The scene that stuck with me is quiet, almost tender between the drifter and the family's daughter, and it's more unbearable than anything explicitly violent in the film. I came away thinking about how some people are just wired as antennas for something terrible, and how little control that leaves them with, and how that's its own private horror movie nobody else can see. Rent-A-Pal, 2020. I watched Rent-A-Pal on a whim and didn't expect a found VHS tape premise to genuinely disturb me, but here we are. David is a lonely man caring for his mother with dementia in the early 90s, searching for connection through a video dating service, when he finds an old VHS tape called Rent-A-Pal, essentially an interactive companion video hosted by a charismatic, increasingly manipulative man named Andy. The horror here is almost entirely about isolation, curdling into something parasocial and then genuinely dangerous. And Wil Wheaton's performance as Andy is unnervingly good, because the tape was recorded once, but somehow always seems to know exactly what David needs to hear in that moment. I'll admit this hit a nerve precisely because I've made a career out of talking to a camera, hoping someone lonely on the other side feels less alone watching it. Rent-A-Pal asks an uncomfortable question. What happens when that one-directional intimacy is the only intimacy someone has left? And what happens when it starts asking things back? I haven't looked at old VHS rental aesthetics the same way since. The Void, 2016. If you grew up on Carpenter and Cronenberg and Fulci, The Void feels less like an homage and more like a seance. A small group of people get trapped in a rural hospital besieged by a cult and something cosmic clawing through from another dimension. And the practical effects team clearly understood that real, tactile, wet monstrosity will always outlast CGI in your memory. There's a creature reveal involving a hospital bed that I genuinely can't unsee. Not because it's the goriest thing I've watched, but because of how patiently the film withholds it, letting dread accumulate in hallways and flickering lights before finally showing its hand. What fascinates me about The Void is its commitment to cosmic indifference. The idea that there's something vast and ancient on the other side of reality that doesn't hate you, doesn't even register you, and will unmake you anyway, simply because you happen to be standing in the wrong hallway. That kind of horror, the universe doesn't care kind, lingers longer for me than any Monster with a Grudge. Killing Ground, 2016. Out of every film on this list, Killing Ground is the one I have the hardest time recommending casually, because it earns every bit of its brutality through structure rather than spectacle. Damien Power tells the story of a camping trip gone catastrophically wrong using a fractured, dual timeline that slowly reveals what happened to one family before another arrives at the same campsite. The horror isn't supernatural at all. It's just men, ordinary-looking men, capable of unthinkable cruelty in a place that's supposed to be peaceful. What destroyed me about this film is its total refusal to look away or cut to black at the moments other films would mercifully spare you. It treats violence the way violence actually happens, clumsily, slowly, without a soundtrack cueing you on how to feel. They Look Like People, 2015. I'm saving this one for last because it might be the most quietly devastating film on this entire list. Perry Blackshear's micro-budget feature follows Wyatt, a man convinced that the people around him, including his oldest friend Christian, are being slowly replaced by something monstrous wearing human faces. The trick of the film is that it never confirms whether Wyatt is perceiving an actual invasion or experiencing a mental health crisis, and it refuses to let you off the hook with a tidy answer. What gutted me is the friendship at the center of it, Christian's patience, his genuine love for Wyatt, set against Wyatt's terrifying conviction that the apocalypse is arriving through people's eyes. I've watched people I love struggle with paranoia and psychosis, and this film captures something true about that experience that I rarely see horror attempt. The horror isn't just for the person experiencing it, it's for the people standing beside them, trying to love someone whose reality has quietly detached from consensus reality. It's a small film with a massive, aching heart, and it haunted me for entirely different reasons than everything else on this list. What ties these 8 films together for me isn't a shared subgenre or aesthetic. It's that none of them needed a recognizable franchise name or a marketing budget to make me feel something I'm still carrying around weeks later. They understood that real horror lives in identity, grief, isolation, and the unbearable gap between what we know to be true and what we feel to be true. If any of these found their way under your skin, the way they found their way under mine, let me know which one hit hardest in the comments, and stick around, because there are plenty more underrated nightmares where these came from.